All of us here probably know about the life and legend of Paul McCartney. 18 Grammys, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, and 100 million records sold only as a solo artist. But it wasn't always like this. You see, after the Beatles broke up, McCartney was lost and didn't even know if he wanted to continue with music. He had been a member of a band his entire life as a musician, so going solo simply didn't feel right for him. Which is probably why he didn't do it, because along with Moody Blues guitarist Denny Laine, drummer Denny Seiwell, and his wife Linda, he formed his new band, Wings. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, this was supposed to be an Elvis Presley video, but you're gonna have to wait till Sunday because we're talking about Wings. The reason why, well, I've been uploading quite a few videos about Paul McCartney in the last month in my channel, his work with the Beatles and as a solo artist, and obviously that includes his work with Wings. And I don't really know why, but every time that I talk about Wings in this channel is in a very negative light, which makes no sense. After all the research I've done on McCartney, it's more than obvious that Wings was a really important part in the process of gaining McCartney's confidence back, in the process of gaining back his credibility, because even though he released two incredible pieces of music before Wings in the form of McCartney 1 and Ram, the critics didn't really agree and the fans didn't agree either. So when I think about Paul McCartney's solo career, I don't really see it being that successful or acclaimed by the critics without Wings, without the process of building another band, without the process of bouncing ideas against other people. And I wanted to make this video to sort of explain my reasons why I believe that Wings was such an important part of McCartney's solo career, even though it's technically not solo. To give you a proper explanation of why I think Wings was so important for McCartney's solo career, I have to take you back to September of 1969, when John Lennon held a meeting with Ringo and Paul to announce that he was leaving the Beatles.
It was a meeting where John came in and said, "Hey guys, I'm leaving the group."
When it comes to John, leaving the Beatles seems like a happy idea. He gets to be with Yoko and he gets to go on all these political adventures that he was involved in the late 60s and early 70s. When it comes to George, it's pretty much the same. I mean, after 1967, it feels like he was just looking for an excuse to leave the band, and actually he left during the recording of the Let It Be album in January of 1969. And when it comes to Ringo, I mean, Ringo's just Ringo. He's fine, just as long as he can play the drums with his friends, or that's the way I perceive it at least. He went on to do 2 covers albums. He participated in the albums of John Lennon and George Harrison, All Things Must Pass, Plastic Ono Band, and Imagine, so it's more than obvious that he was just fine. But that's not the case when it comes to Paul McCartney. I mean, the man was so depressed that he had to take a break in his farm in Scotland with his wife Linda and his kids because he couldn't deal with the idea of continuing with his music career without the Beatles. During this time, he was so alienated that he barely even participated in the promotion of the Abbey Road album, and this rumor about him being dead after 1966 became more and more relevant, along with him being barefoot in the Abbey Road cover and all that. Actually, believe it or not, a lot of people, including McCartney himself, believe that without Linda by his side, he wouldn't have continued with music. He had John Lennon ever since 1957 when they met for the first time in July. Then he had George Harrison, then Ringo. He always had someone to bounce his ideas against, and now he was all alone, which may be the reason why, instead of finding a new partner, he decided to do everything on his own in the McCartney album, where he was responsible for the instrumentation, the songwriting, the vocal performance, and the production of the record. Nowadays, you and I know that McCartney 1 is highly regarded as one of his best albums, and one of the most influential ones too. But back in the day, critics absolutely demolished that album, and fans weren't happy with it either. And they had their reasons. I mean, John Lennon released Plastic Ono Band, and George Harrison released All Things Must Pass, 2 of the most accomplished albums of the 70s. And seeing McCartney release such an unfinished and unpolished piece of music was obviously confusing to them, I guess. So I can just imagine McCartney's reaction, being so confused as to what you want from music, releasing an album that's so intimate and so personal and people don't like it. I mean, come on. And the saddest thing about this is that it didn't only happen once, but twice, because he went on to do Ram with Linda, an album that's also a masterpiece, incredibly influential, and nowadays is seen as one of the greatest solo releases by the Beatles. But when the album dropped, not only the critics, not only the fans, but also other members of the Beatles like Ringo and George were saying really terrible things about the album. When I read the original reviews for this album, it's so shocking to me that these were written by actual journalists. I mean, the lack of vision, the lack of understanding of the music is so vast, and this comes from the same people that reviewed albums like The Velvet Underground, many of the most experimental Beatles albums like Plastic Ono Band, where John Lennon screams, not sings in a high pitch, no, screams for about 2 to 3 minutes in the track Well, Well, Well. Because the situation here is not that the album is good, but it was labeled as a bad album. No, it was labeled as one of the worst albums of 1971, and now it's one of the most incredible and influential albums ever made. that's ridiculous. How can you fuck up that badly? Obviously, Paul wasn't a fan of the poor reception his albums were getting, but he enjoyed making music, and more importantly, he enjoyed making music with Linda. As a matter of fact, he was so excited about the music he made and the music he wanted to do that he wanted to go back to touring, but for that he needed a band. And that is exactly the reason why he enlisted a drummer, Denny Seiwell, and a guitarist, Denny Lane, and his wife Linda to create the band Wings. Now, if you know anything about the story of Wings, you know that the first album, Wild Life, was not received very well by the critics. It seemed like that was a trend in the early 70s, but the second album, Red Rose Speedway, showed that McCartney was going back to his melodic nature. He wasn't trying to be that experimental anymore, he just wanted to be a regular rock and roll band. And it seems like it worked, because this album was not only a comeback for McCartney in terms of commercial success, but also when it comes to critical acclaim. I mean, critics had mixed feelings about this album, but you know, mixed feelings is way better than absolutely demolishing the record. The first two albums were already incredibly important in the process of building up McCartney's leadership and also going back to live performances, because around 1972, they were touring college campuses and small venues, and McCartney was really happy about that. But it's their second album of 1973 the one that takes all the roses in my opinion, because Band on the Run is the first actual success of Paul McCartney's career after the Beatles. I mean, the album was so good that even the critics that didn't like McCartney, you know, that were willing to drag every single release that he put out after the Beatles, didn't have a choice but to love this album. That is how good this album is. I think right now the album is at 9 million copies sold, which would make it the best-selling ex-Beatle album ever released, which is crazy considering that you have albums like All Things Must Pass, Imagine, and Double Fantasy. But most importantly, with this album, McCartney gained his confidence back, and he was able to do albums like Venus and Mars, like Wings at the Speed of Sound, like London Town. And maybe these albums are not exactly the greatest, you know, they have a lot of flaws, but they definitely pack a punch, you know, and include some of the most successful songs that Paul McCartney ever released, like With a Little Luck, Silly Love Songs, Let Him In, Listen to What the Man Said, Magneto, and Titanium Man. I mean, some of his best songs, and all of this was thanks to the success of Band on the Run. And even though he's the main songwriter and he participates in a lot of the instrumentation, and he's the mastermind behind every single one of these albums, it's more than obvious that he couldn't have made an album like Band on the Run without Denny Lane and without Linda McCartney. They were truly, truly, really important for all of these albums, and that is the reason why I say all the time that without Wings, we wouldn't really have the Paul McCartney we know today. The Paul McCartney we had in 1971 wasn't really sure about what he wanted from music. He didn't know if he actually had it outside of the Beatles, you know, if he was able to create beautiful cutting-edge melodies without John Lennon telling him what to do with certain segments of the songs he didn't like. But after Band on the Run, Venus and Mars, Wings at the Speed of Sound, London Town, and Back to the Egg, it was more than obvious that he had all the tools to make amazing music and amazing albums, which is probably the reason why 2 years after the band broke up, he started to work on Tug of War, which is one of his best albums. He also has albums like Flowers in the Dirt in 1989, Flaming Pie in 1997, and even now, 2020, with McCartney 3, one of his best late-era albums. Oh, and by the way, I almost forgot, not only did he gain his confidence back in the studio, but also on stage, because Wings Over America, released in 1976, is one of the best, if not the best, live album ever released. It was honestly amazing to witness, and obviously I wasn't around back then. I was born in 2001. I've never actually seen McCartney live, unfortunately, but if you listen to his albums in a chronological order, you can see the difference between Wings Paul McCartney and early 70s Paul McCartney. You know, you see a shy, insecure person trying to put out the music that he feels like he wants to do, experimental, intimate, private, and sometimes really, really weird and quirky and fun and playful. And then you see a guy that has such an ability to create melodies, such an ability to create catchy, fun, playful, energetic, euphoric music, having the time of his life with a band that's not restricting him like John Lennon did in the Beatles days, you know. And even though that restriction and that contrast in the Lennon-McCartney duo is probably what made it so incredible and so influential, you know, resulting in some of the most important albums and songs ever made. And sometimes you do miss John Lennon's more direct songwriting style in the Wings discography. I personally find it really refreshing seeing Paul McCartney have so much fun and enjoying himself so much in all of these albums. And though I will say that in my opinion, around 1976, 1977, McCartney was a little too deep in his comfort zone, resulting in some of the most boring and generic songs that he ever wrote, I think that all of this was kind of necessary, you know, for McCartney's growth as an artist. I think that it's thanks to the fact that Paul McCartney was able to be free in every single one of these albums that we had, albums like McCartney 2 and albums like Tug of War and albums like Press to Play, you know, albums where McCartney was constantly trying to do something new. I think that McCartney was able to do whatever he wanted to do for a whole decade, after being part of the Beatles, which usually means a lot of restrictions. You're in a band with two of the greatest songwriters of all time. Obviously, you're not going to get to do whatever you want. Instead, Wings gave McCartney that freedom to try every single sound he wanted to try and to do a generic album if that's what he wanted to do. I think doing that in the 70s gave McCartney this desire to do something new with his music after he left Wings in the 80s. So I think that's the reason why it's so important for him. And even though their breakup was a little stupid, actually, there's no official breakup. Everyone kind of just went their own way after McCartney got busted in Japan for carrying marijuana.
The charge yesterday, I was just caught with a small quantity of cannabis. But let's get one thing straight. Can we get one thing straight? That whatever you think and whatever you think I've done, this, I'm telling you, this substance, cannabis, is a whole lot less harmful than rum punch, whiskey, nicotine, and glue, all of which are perfectly legal.
So if you find yourself enjoying any of the Paul McCartney albums after the 70s, like McCartney 2, like Tug of War, Flowers in the Dirt, Flaming Pie, or Chaos and Creation in the Backyard, you have to look back at the Wings discography and say thank you very much. Even if you don't like a vast majority of their albums, like Wings at the Speed of Sound, Back to the Egg, and London Town, it still gave us some of the most important moments of McCartney's evolution as a solo artist, reconciliation with music critics, first commercial success after the Beatles broke up, and him going back to touring. So even if you don't want to admit it, even if you disagree with me, even if you don't like me saying it, I personally believe that it's undeniable that Linda McCartney and Denny Laine saved Paul McCartney's solo career.
I'd like to direct this question to Messrs. Lennon and McCartney. In a recent article, Time magazine put down pop music, and they referred to Day Tripper as being about a prostitute, and Norwegian Wood as being about a lesbian. Now, I just wanted to know what your intent was when you wrote it, and what your feeling is about the Time magazine criticism of the music that is being written today.
We were just trying to write songs about prostitutes and lesbians, that's all.
And that is going to be it for today's video. I really hope that you guys enjoyed. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out a song, an album, or an artist, leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your request as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.